Thank you, Leah. I hope you can all hear me. On behalf of Impact Initiatives, we're very pleased to present to everybody today. Thank you very much, Leah, and her team for inviting us. So in the next few minutes, I will present to you an approach to identifying areas, community areas, for response planning and aid delivery, and that we are actually currently piloting in various different crisis-affected urban areas around the globe. I will first outline the approach itself, talk about the lessons learned so far from our first 2 pilot rounds, and then present some key findings to illustrate the usefulness of this approach. So I will not lose much time on explaining the rationale of identifying community areas or areas of intervention for response planning, as I think these reflections have been sufficiently discussed in the first hour. But in order to understand our approach to identifying areas, it is important to underpin the rationale of our particular approach. So we at Impact Initiatives, we're seeking to find a way to most reliably identify humanitarian needs, but also pre-existing local capacities in out-of-camp settings. Meaning our approach to identifying areas is crucially based on the objective to find reliable information on the ground in such settings. So it kind of nurtures an evidence base that can then inform where and how to respond. So that kind of ties back into the first part of this webinar. So in fact, our area-based approach is twofold. First, we identify a community area, or area of knowledge, if you want so, as conceived by its very own inhabitants. And once we have this geographic entity, once we have that identified, we then seek to identify people that have the best knowledge about this area. And as visualized here on the slide, as visualized here on the slide on the right, we look for key informant networks in and across identified community areas. And through social network analysis, we're then trying to find the best connected and thereby possibly the most reliable key informants for each identified community area. But today's webinar focuses more on defining areas, so I will not go much further into social network analysis, but we'll concentrate really on how we identify these community areas. So based on this rationale, let me now show you how we identify community areas or areas of knowledge. So we use a very well-known qualitative research approach, focus group discussions. And adding to this, we add a mapping component, a participatory mapping component. So we're talking about mapping focus group discussions. Armed with maps and different zoom levels, color pens, a note taker, a facilitator, we go to communities and conduct MFGDs, mapping focus group discussions, with 5 to 10 community members, usually of the same sex and same population type. That means either host population or displaced population. And the first thing that we would do is to explain very well the rationale of our approach, so that MFGD participants know from the outset that we're trying to identify community areas in order to find the most informed community members for this area on topics related to service access, population characteristics, humanitarian needs. And this from the outset avoids that participants stick too much to official boundaries or scale up their understanding of community area too much. A small anecdote, during our first pilots in Jordan, our first MFGD rounds, we naively just introduced the question, what is your community area, or where does your community live? And knowing that the word community can have many different scales in Arabic and can very well, for example, refer to the community of fellow Muslims, one MFGD participant replied, well, his community area reaches from Istanbul to Mecca. So we learned from that, and what we then tried to do was introducing a map of the larger surroundings, and at first familiarizing participants with the map by pointing out main landmarks such as mosques, hospitals, schools, etc. And the key here really is that you describe very well on the map using the local names of streets and landmarks so that participants can really visualize the map, and what we found is that most participants can then usually very fast orient themselves on a map. And then what we would then do, we would ask some first probing questions. So for example, where do you access daily services? Where do you go to the barber? Where do you send your children to school? Where's your hospital? And then that leads already to asking for local names of areas. around which their daily lives are centered. So by then we are usually already at the point where several neighborhood or area names have been dropped by the participants. And then we would ask for similarities and differences between these areas. So for example, are people who live in this part the same as people who live in that part? And answers could then range from yes, absolutely, a silly question, to no, on this side people are much richer, they send their children to private schools, and on that side people from a different ethnicity live there, and households are generally much poorer, and there's no interaction whatsoever between the two different populations. So in that sense, we try to establish similarities and differences between those different names, different areas that have been named. And then we want to know, where do these differences start? Yeah. So in order to delineate areas with certain characteristics. And sometimes there's obviously some sort of continuum between two areas, but very often what we found is that landmarks, hospitals, schools, police stations, and so on, or certain infrastructures, mostly main streets, or geographic boundaries such as hills, ditches, riverbeds, that they mark a clear boundary between such areas. And these boundaries are usually also conceived as boundaries by local inhabitants. And in so proceeding, we usually do several MFGDs per locality. And then we usually see some sort of data saturation. So that means we always come out with the same boundaries that have been drawn, with the same area names that are used by different focus group discussion participants. And then based on this data, we're able to draw a city map with different community areas, community boundaries, disposing of a certain profile, certain characteristics for each of these boundaries. And such common characteristics that we find usually are more or less same livelihood and income, more or less similar population density, tribal origin or ethnicities, same employment patterns or economic activities in one area, and all of these commonly shared characteristics then usually define one area. So on the next slide, you see our results from our very first pilot that has been conducted in Mafraq city in the north of Jordan. And on the left you see official neighborhood boundaries, and on the right you see our results, sort of the endogenously identified community areas. And you see that there's quite a difference between the two. And the differences in Mafraq city are mostly that official boundaries, they span over uninhabited areas that weren't mentioned as a particular community area to us. Official boundaries mostly on the periphery, as you can see in the southwest of Mafraq, they don't include newer settlements that have been installed outside the initial city boundaries. And in the case of Mafraq city, it's also a very interesting one. Names often change entirely, like official neighborhood names have nothing to do with the community names, with the names used by community members for a specific area. And in one case, it was even the case that an official neighborhood name referred to an entirely different area than the community area that was known under the same name. You can see an overlay of these two areas. Here we have in white the official boundaries, official neighborhood boundaries, and with the gray lines we have the community boundaries as we identified them, together with MFGD participants. And you see that, while in some cases there's some overlap, especially if you look in the northeast, especially at the periphery, official neighborhood boundaries correspond to our boundaries, or the boundaries that we identified as community area boundaries. But globally, there is not too much overlap. What you see often, however, is that main roads, they do coincide, and they usually have official boundaries overlapping with perceived community area boundaries. But other than that, what we found from Mafraq city is that community areas are quite different from the official neighborhood boundaries. And to end this presentation, I will show you our last findings, our latest findings from a similar pilot that we have been conducting in Difa in the east of Niger. It's quite a different context than Mafraq, because in Difa you don't really have official neighborhoods as such. There are official neighborhood names, but no one can really pin them down. There's no official boundaries for the official neighborhoods. We're talking about 6 official neighborhood names, and we identified 10 community areas, as you can see on this map. Again, main roads, geographic patterns, infrastructure, very much served as delimiting factors for community areas. So I don't want to go too much over time, so I think I'll leave it at that, and very happy to answer any questions about this approach.